Biomutant is an all-new open-world action RPG from the recently founded indie dev team at Experiment 101. Originally announced a million years ago or so in the summer of 2017, Biomutant's eye-catching character design and stylistic premise grabbed people. Years passed, though, with little info beyond that it was still being worked on, and then, rather suddenly, at the beginning of this year, we got a release date. Speaking for myself, when the review code came in for this, I really didn't know what to expect. I hadn't kept up with what the game was over the last 4 years, but I had remained intrigued and hopeful it would turn out to be decent because throughout all of the last 4 years, the game had continued to look cute and refreshing and like a nice little breath of fresh air. After about 20 hours of playtime so far, I'm happy to say that parts of Biomutant are indeed cute and refreshing and a breath of fresh air, though it is hindered by an excess of familiar, old, open-world design philosophies and repetition. You'll begin Biomutant by engaging with the game's greatest strength, that of customization. The first instance of this comes from the character creation. The choices you make at the beginning of the game regarding class, breed, and even starting stats will dramatically affect the way your cute little rodent creature ends up looking. It's a neat system, one that you could easily spend a ton of time with, and one that should yield an enormous variety of player characters once people get their hands on it. I really do look forward to seeing what the community creates with this system. The nice thing is that, regardless of your starting choice of stats or class, you can still unlock anything and everything character-related later in the game as you play. We'll talk about that more in a bit. It should also be noted that, unfortunately, one of the 6 classes is initially locked behind a pre-order paywall, which is just... You can unlock it later, which is fine, but still. As a quick caveat, I wish publishers would stop trying to ramrod so much monetized pre-order stuff into completely unproven all-new games from all-new teams. You want to sell a gigantic statue for Halo Infinite? Sure, go for it. It's like the 8th Halo game, I get it. But do we really need pre-order bonuses and a collector's edition and a $400 edition of Biomutant? Really? No one even knows if the game is good or that anyone will like it yet. Please, publishers, just calm down with this stuff. Oh god, the business of video games continues to be very dumb. Anyways, after the decent first impression the game makes with the character creator, all of that energy is lost in the far too long and very, very slow opening hour. It's a linear, mega tutorialized, story-heavy, hard-to-follow, hand-holdy walkthrough, and still fails to explain some of the key systems within the game. Once you trudge through that, though, you are mostly let free into the gigantic open world. And make no mistakes, this is a big, familiar, open world game. Do you like collectibles? Do you like outposts? Do you like fetch quests? Do you like loot? Biomutant has all of those in abundance. The thing I like most from that list is loot. Loot is good. I like loot. Making the numbers go higher is nice. Hearing the cooler sounds and seeing yellow, orange, or red colors pop up for higher tiers of loot pleases me. Biomutant has loot. A lot of loot. There's so much loot. Too much loot? No, I don't think so. I don't think there's such a thing as too much loot. We'll get to all the other things in Biomutant in a minute, but right now I want to talk about the loot and crafting that loot into cooler, better loot. Loot, loot, loot. Drink every time I say loot. Don't do that. You'll be opening a loot container approximately every 2 seconds as you play and collect an utterly ridiculous amount of stuff. You'll find tiers of healing items, mana boosts, clothing items of all shapes and sizes, add-ons for the clothing, and then weapon-related loot for both melee and guns. You'll find weapon handles, blade types, grips, stocks, barrels, it goes on, and let me tell you, it never stops. I kind of hate how easily loot pleases me. The great thing is, though, that all this weapon loot feeds into my favorite part of Biomutant, the best part of Biomutant, which is the weapon creation. You see, all that loot is used to make new guns or melee weapons for yourself, and you are completely free to create anything you want with what you have. Oddly, this part of the game is not well explained at all. Perhaps I just missed a tutorial pop-up in the long hour of tutorial pop-ups at the beginning of the game. I'm not sure, but it was only after struggling through a boss with my starting weapons 5 hours into the game that I took the time to dig around through the messy menus to discover how the crafting system worked. And yeah, it's delightful to be allowed to go wild with those systems. You are limited in the crafting by the number of various scrap materials you have, and for a while I thought the only way to get those scraps were 1 or 2 at a time from scrap totems scattered around the world, and I was worried. Thankfully, I discovered that any loot you don't like, you simply scrap it, and scrapping it gives you the materials. Again, the scrapping system was not something that was explained by the game unless I missed it. Related to that, you also oddly cannot mark loot as junk and then scrap it all or sell it all. It's a really weird quality of life feature to not have in a game in 2021, and especially one where you are just picking up so much loot all the time. You also can't just scrap something as soon as you pick it up when you're viewing what you've got. It's a weird thing to not have in a game like this. Mercifully, the game has 0 inventory requirements. You're never going to run out of space, so if you're a hoarder like me, you'll be safe here. Anyways, this weapon crafting system is probably the single biggest thing that has kept me coming back to the game. Finding new gear with fun perks on them or weird aesthetics to them, and then being able to combine them into something that immediately has a positive impact on combat is fantastic. It's a system I'd love to see more in loot-based games. Weapon customization is just one of those things that I like in games, I don't know why, and Biomutant has some of the best I've seen. This delightful sandbox of weapon creation would all be for naught if the combat didn't hold up, and I think Biomutant's combat is mostly there. It's not perfect, it's not even great, but it's fun enough to keep me going and doesn't get in the way too much. With combat, like many other parts of the game, you've got a lot to choose from. You've got melee, you've got guns, and within those two categories there are subcategories of weapons to choose from. Do you want to go double melee with quick slashing attacks, or maybe a heavier two-handed approach? Maybe you'd prefer to go all in on guns and dual wield them. I just started dual wielding guns in combination with a newly acquired levitate ability, which has been very silly and powerful. Be it melee or guns or both, you'll be engaging in the combat a lot, and like I said, I think it's most of the way there. Melee is driven by a button combo style system of executing movesets, and the gunplay is driven by, well, you pull the right trigger, of course, but it also has a combo and moveset system like Melee. Regardless of what weapon you choose, the actual inputs required to execute moves is always the same. The moves themselves are different, but within each class of weapon, the button combos never change, which is helpful for dumb people like me who just cannot remember anything more than XXY. I'm still digging into different weapon types and setups after 20 hours, which is impressive. Like the character customizer at the start and weapon creation throughout, the freedom of choice with how you approach combat here remains refreshing. Like I said though, combat isn't perfect and could do for a lot of improvement, melee especially. The gun combat is fine? It's fine. I know fine is like the most useless and lazy term to use in a review, but I can't think of really any other way to describe it. It's fine. It feels fine. It reminds me of older Ratchet and Clank titles, perhaps. It's pretty mindless and utilizes a loose lock-on system that could be better. The melee uses this loose lock-on too, and I do often wish it had a more traditional hard lock-on system in place. Melee, though, I wish felt a lot better. I think one of the biggest missing pieces for me is a sense of weight and impact in the attacks, a lot of which I think is due to sound, or rather lack thereof. The sounds of weapon impacts are mostly imperceptible in combat, the vibrational feedback is light when you're playing on a controller, and enemies brush off hits with minimal reactions. One weapon I enjoyed using for much of the early hours of the game was a crushing axe that would knock small foes to the ground, and that felt good because of how dramatically it caused enemies to react. The other melee weapons I've used though just feel too weightless throughout. The melee combat is also hindered by the parry system. Now, it needs to be said, I suck at parrying. I am the type of player that just is going to stand there and tank everything and ignore those systems in games. It's just how I am, I don't know. But in Biomutant there is a large emphasis on parrying incoming attacks, which can stun enemies and possibly even allow you to get them into the air, granting you reprieve from other incoming attacks to focus on this single air juggled enemy. The problem with the parry system though is that the visual indicator for it is this incredibly hard to spot little symbol in combat. Combat is flashy, there are lots of particles flying around, some comic book style callouts of attacks, explosions popping off everywhere, it goes on. There are also a lot of enemies in most encounters, and the parry icon just gets lost in all this noise when it's popping up above their head and then vanishing almost immediately. It all combines for me into a parry system that's just incredibly difficult to engage with. I'm only just starting to get maybe a little better at it after 20 hours, but even then, not so much. It's especially frustrating because there are so many enemy attacks that knock you back or knock you down fully. Other enemies can pick you up and throw you to the ground or ground pound you, and some of those attacks can't be parried, they can only be dodged, but the animation tells on those attacks are also hard to read amongst all the other noise and chaos. Those constant interruptions, because you're unable to catch parry windows, really leads to a lot of frustration. If there's one thing I think that needs to be improved quickly with Biomutant, it's the parrying system. The few times where I've been able to pull off a bunch of parries and air juggle an enemy and repeat that with another enemy and then quickly clear out a combat encounter has felt good. It's just far too often that I'm flat on my back from missing attacks and being knocked over. It's what has kept me coming back to and leaning on gun combat over melee. You're just far less likely to get knocked down or interrupted when you're further back from enemy attacks shooting with guns. Combat also offers various spells you can acquire throughout the game. Psionic powers and biogenetic mutations are bought using skill points earned through leveling up and hunting down specific collectibles, and there are some fun abilities in there. The earlier ones are very simple, like vomiting on an enemy and having them run around infecting other enemies briefly, but later skills can get very silly. You can get telekinesis to pick up and throw enemies, or call down a weird energy lightning bolt, or cover yourself with a mucus bubble that you roll around inside of and you stick enemies to, and then you pop and send them flying and they take damage. It's good stuff and further complements the freedom of playstyle on offer, but most of the enjoyable powers only come much further into the game. You can also unlock additional attacks with skill points and various perks that enhance your playstyle, though I wish the perks in particular were more powerful. There are some decent ones in there, more near the bottom of the list, costing more points, but a lot of them are just useless in a way that I don't understand. Like 5% increased movement speed to mounts? Why would I buy that? Why is it 5%? Why is it not 50%? Or there's another that gets you a 10% damage buff with psionic powers at night. 10%? Like who cares? A lot of Biomutant is good about letting you become powerful and embracing the goofiness, but the perks are just largely very tame and uninteresting, which is a shame. It's a single player game, let us become brokenly overpowered. The combat made a genuinely poor first impression for me and took several hours to start to click, but has consistently gotten more enjoyable the further in I've progressed, mainly due to acquiring different abilities and getting much more powerful and chaotic weapons. Though the game also has enemy level scaling, which keeps everything you fight right around your level, plus or minus maybe 5 levels, so you never get to that state where you go back to an earlier area and just one-shot everything, which is a shame. I would have liked to have seen a level scaling toggle in the game options. Those psionic powers and biomutations I mentioned earlier are also locked behind morality system levels. I was surprised to learn just how much Biomutant leans into RPG systems when I realized it had a morality system that seemingly impacts large swaths of the game. It's a bit of an odd system to have in the game, I think. Every choice related to morality that you come across is simply black or white, and you can easily sway your morality state from extreme dark to extreme light, or vice versa. I went dark initially and managed to max out that dark stat in about 14 hours, which gave me access to unlock any and all of the dark powers, and now I'm very easily swinging that morality slider back to extreme light to get access to the other light powers. While I do appreciate the game allowing me to do this and get any and every ability all in one playthrough, the system feels a little out of place and unnecessary considering how easy it is to swing from good to evil and back again. The morality system, while affecting your character skills, comes up most often throughout the story, and oh my god, I was not prepared for how much writing there is in Biomutant. You'll constantly be talking to characters and engaging in story content, and the writing here is largely decent, I think. I really respect the effort the developers have put into creating a world where these creatures have sort of figured out all the old world things around them, but them not being human and there having been so much time passed has resulted in all of their lingo for things being completely different. Everything in Biomutant has a different term for it, and again, I respect the effort, and I've enjoyed seeing what these terms mean or finding out what this everyday object like a computer is called in their weird world. But this emphasis on bizarre terminology results in pretty much every sentence being loaded with unfamiliar words, which can often make the writing hard to follow. The writing can also be hard to follow due to there being essentially only one voice actor in the game. The developers gave themselves an interesting problem to solve. They're an indie team that obviously can't afford a Witcher 3-like cast of actors to read the huge amount of writing they have for the game, so everyone you meet in Biomutant speaks gibberish. It's a foreign language, but it's gibberish in the game. It's not an uncommon solution. Where Biomutant makes the interesting choice is that the main character has this little insect automaton with him at all times that acts as a translator. So there is voice acting in the game, but it's one voice actor who is in-world translating all of the incoming foreign language dialogue for the hero. Again, I respect the ambition and problem solving here. The story team has spent a huge amount of time making this world and filling it with writing, and the narrator, or the translator, or whatever you want to call him, is good. I'm 90% sure it's the narrator of the Stanley Parable, and he does a fine job throughout.
says he's surprised to see anyone this far out.
But when you combine a lot of gobbledygook words with a huge amount of writing and the same voice actor reading it for hours and hours, it really starts to blur together. The narrator will also chime in when you're exploring the world and in combat, and you can adjust the frequency with which he does that, which I'd recommend as it's too often and the writing for those chimes is a little obnoxious. You can also adjust the volume level of the narrator to 0 if you'd like, and just have the character speak gibberish and you read the subtitles. Unfortunately, those factors really do combine to make the story hard to keep up with. You've got this pretty standard open world checklist game, which we'll talk about next, clashing with a ton of dialogue sequences full of weird lingo, all being read by the same voice actor. Sometimes I'm enjoying the writing, there are quirky characters getting up to strange things out there in the world, but a little ways into each play session, my eyes start to glaze over. I think a lot of people are going to find this to be the most obnoxious part of the game. Some of the dialogue sequences just go on for so long, where the character you're speaking with says so much stuff, and they say it in gibberish first, and then the narrator reads it, and it can really suck energy out of a session. The developers really go for it with the quantity of story, but at the end of the day, I wish they had dramatically trimmed it down into something more focused and digestible. Speaking of going for it, Biomutant sure is a gigantic open world checklist game. While there are certainly more traditional side quests to be found here and there, in addition to main story missions of course, most of the side content in the game is some form of collectible. In fact, many side quests may start off as seeming to be a unique standalone quest, only to conclude with find all 10 of this thingamajig. You'll have quest upon quest that is simply collect all 5 of this, or all 15 of that, or 7 of these, etc, etc. It's simply too much. I do appreciate that the game marks down all of the locations of these collectibles so there's no guesswork, but they are always marked as blue side quests as well. It's sort of like that cyberpunk car quests situation again to me, where I see a blue marker on the map thinking it's a quest, hover over it, and find out it's just another collectible thing. For a game with so many things to collect, it's also weird to find that there is no mini-map or compass in the game. Okay, there is literally a compass in the game, but it's just a compass. Like, it just shows you the cardinal directions and that's it. I have no idea why it's there. It's completely useless. I turned it off after a while. The only way to figure out where you want to head next is to open your main map and select the quest or place a marker on it. It's a bizarre omission, and having to go into the map constantly interrupts that nice, mindless, just one more thing game flow that an open world checklist can trigger. And when you do find the latest thingamajig you're looking for, you are greeted with a puzzle, and boy do they ever use this so-called puzzle a lot. It's simply a rotation puzzle reskinned into many different variants. You just rotate the things to get the colors to match, and they have never been difficult or engaging, and there are so many of them everywhere, and the narrator always says the same thing every time you do them, and oh my god, I just wish they would autocomplete or they weren't there at all. The overwhelming majority of the side content is going down checklist after checklist. Probably my biggest problem with Biomutant is the repetitive game loop. You run around and loot so much stuff, you fight some enemies, you do a puzzle, destroy a scrap totem, find a collectible, and move on. Parts of the footage in this review will surely be blending together at this point because of how repetitive it can get. When you stumble into an area with radiation or heat or cold, you have to go back to a satellite and ping the location of a suit that'll protect you. You find that suit, then return to the hazardous zone and do the same loop of running around, fighting, looting, and doing some puzzles. Repetition is everywhere in Biomutant, even outside of the core game loop. Every outpost you take over has the same 4 vendors, an upgrade bench, a couple of side quests. The narrator says the same thing with every puzzle. Just a few moves left, make them count. There are only about 4 pieces of music in the game, and while I like the music, they interrupt or restart often, and it's really aggravating. Even the gibberish the characters speak repeats way too much. What you're doing, seeing, and hearing in Hour 1 of Biomutant is the same in Hour 20, and it can really start to blur together. I don't hate it though, I really don't. Which is surprising to me because I have bounced off of so many open world games over the years, especially those that are Bloated and Ubisoft-like collectathons, which Biomutant absolutely is. Perhaps this game has hit at the right time for me, where I'm in the right mindset. Perhaps I just like the more simpler, more mediocre open world games. I don't know. I'm the one man on earth that liked Rage 2, so maybe there's no helping me. I don't know. Like I said earlier, the loot and weapons of Biomutant are the main thing that keeps me coming back, but that's not the only thing that keeps me coming back. There's something to Biomutant that I just sort of struggle to quantify. There's just something about it that I like. It's more than the sum of its overly familiar parts. It's charming. It's endearing. It's well put together for how big and ambitious it is in relation to the studio's size. There are rough edges around almost every corner, but I've never had any crashes. I had one single bug early on where I couldn't move, and simply saving and reloading fixed it. It's easygoing moment to moment and even easier to play for long stretches. The world is bright and full of color, and a lot of the game really does look great on PC, though there are unfortunately many drab and concrete areas that really counteract that nice colorful look. The characters you meet are quirky. Everyone are these little adorable rodent creatures wearing funny outfits and shooting guns made out of garbage and building societies, and I like all of it. More than anything, it's got a good heart and a good vibe at all times, and in a way that I'm finding really hard to quit. On paper, I shouldn't be enjoying the game all that much. I should have bounced off of it at least 10 hours ago, but I keep wanting to jump back in and see what the other parts of the world will look like, see more quirky character designs, and make and use more dumb weapons. It's a game that has way too much stuff in it. There are too many systems, too much writing, too many collectibles, too much repetition. Nearly every part of the game has problems and could have been improved. It's a game that should have been reined in and better focused, but I keep coming back to Biomutant because it has a soul, and it's a soul that I like. The ambitions of this small 20-person developer exceeded their grasp, but it's the distinct personality of Biomutant that stands out to me. If there's one word that I keep coming back to in my head while playing it and while writing this, it's endearing. Many will bounce off of Biomutant for being overly familiar or for having gone in expecting something much more AAA, but for some of you out there like me, you might just find something to latch onto with this weird, endearing, not-so-little game.